And for our final panel this afternoon, this one will be focused not on skills and education, but on immigration, a policy topic that is certainly one that is the subject of a great deal of attention and discussion. And so I very much look forward to this conversation. And so I'd invite everyone to welcome the participants of our second panel to the stage. And I guess I'll just start by introducing our moderator, Michelle, who's the Executive Director of the Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation at the IRPP. And his research focuses on Canadian politics, comparative public policy, and public opinion. Mireille Paquet, professor in the Department of Political Science at Concordia University, where she also holds the University Research Chair on Immigration Policy. Robert Falconer, who is a research fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy and the Schurz Doctoral Fellow at the London School of Economics. Mikal, Skuterud, professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Waterloo, director of the Canadian Labour Economic Forum, and a fellow in residence and the Roger Phillips Scholar of Social Policy at the Howe Institute. And finally, Rupa Banerjee, professor of Human Resource Management and Organizational Behaviour at TMU, and the Head Research Chair in Economic Inclusion, Employment, Entrepreneurship. Thanks a lot. I look forward to the conversation.
Merci Trevor, merci pour l'invitation, ça me fait plaisir d'être ici. C'est un magnifique panel que nous avons. Je vais bien entendu poser les questions en anglais. Je souhaitais juste dire à ceux, si vous voulez poser des questions en français, il me fera plaisir de la traduire si besoin il y a. Alors, I'm not going to reintroduce you, so I'll jump right in. If we had this panel a few years ago, and maybe we can disagree or quibble on how far back we need to go, but I think the conclusion would have been that immigration was one of the few broad areas of Canadian policy where there was a real consensus, right? Was framed as an economic advantage, both on the demographic and talent strategy aspects, that it was really like at the heart and it was a success for our future growth. But conversation has changed to one of a system that is under strain, whether we're talking about, and again, we can quibble, but housing, infrastructure, backlogs, credentials, bottlenecks, and then there's the temporary resident question, whether through the temporary foreign workers or international students that have project that the temporary residents have grown faster than any other part of the system, and perhaps with the least democratic debate or long-term strategy behind it, at least from the outside. So we're at a moment when the system, it would seem, need a recalibration, I guess. And the Prime Minister said that there would be an immigration plan in the budget next week. And we'll get to that in a second. And I thought I was going to start with this, but I'm going to end with this just to keep you on your toes. Sorry. That was... okay, so we talk a lot about intake, about numbers, levels, streams, targets. And we'll talk about that too. But first, I just wanted to talk about process and whether the real productivity win are actually there, right? So faster credential recognition, matching, reducing the backlog. So what should we do here? Is that where we should start? And if we start there, what do we start with? Again, keeping the theme of this meeting in mind of growth and productivity. Rupa seems like she grabbed the mic and she's ready to go. Yeah, you can go.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I may have suggested this question.
Yeah.
But yes, I definitely think that there's a big story with the process and this question about how's our immigration system working? How can we better leverage our immigrants? So that new, right? We've been talking about this for 30 years. And in fact, in the past 10 years, if you just look at like wages or employment, things are actually getting better for permanent immigrants rather than getting worse. So I would say that we have a long-standing problem of leveraging immigrant skills. We still don't have a really effective way of assessing foreign credentials. We still don't necessarily have a great way of evaluating folks who are not in regulated professions. So we talk a lot about the barriers to regulated professions, but there's also huge barriers to unregulated professions because it's so much more based on employer ad hoc decision making. So I think, while we can talk about supply, numbers, who should let in, who shouldn't, once folks are here, if they can't use their skills, then that has a bigger impact than just on productivity. That has an impact on social cohesion. It has an impact that is long-term and extremely damaging.
Yep, Mireille.
If I may just add, so of course, underemployment, I would put under this large umbrella. So both from discrimination to barriers to entry because of recognition. But I would also add that one other thing that I think we might have missed with our current obsession with levels and finding the right number of people is how we can actually better link labor market players into the immigration system. So there used to be kind of two solutions. So one was the TFW program where the employers are asking to bring in people, and we'll talk about that later. And another innovation that happened about a little more than 12 years ago now was a program that allowed employers with express entry to actually look for people in a pool of skilled or pre-selected migrants. But these never really delivered on promises. So, there's a lot of unintended effects of the TFW program. And then when we know that most of our enterprises are small and medium enterprises, the actual kind of step to be able to engage with the immigration system and to really think about who they need, and we just talked about that, but also how do we get them, has never really been worked through in our immigration system. So I think that that's another way in which, instead of thinking about numbers, thinking about process would go a long way. And the other thing I would add is that we are suffering right now from one of the biggest backlog in treating files, both permanently and temporary. And so that means that even if we had a responsive immigration system where we allowed employers to really kind of go in, we wouldn't be able to get the people for a long time. And so there's always been this issue in Canada, but right now it is more than acute.
Mikal or Robert, anyone wants to...
Okay. I'm not really sure. I got a lot of thoughts in my mind. I'm not really sure where to go.
We can work through that.
But I'll give you a couple of them. Yeah. Well, so, I'm listening to this. I'm really a fish out of water, I feel like, in these kinds of discussions, because, on the one hand, I'm hearing a lot about the government needs to create a lot more jobs, and the government's going to, has this big project. So the government's going to drive the labor demand side of the economy, and we've got to figure out what the winners are there. And then the other side, I hear all this talk about, there's this huge role for the government to create the skills that the workers have that are going to meet these job vacancies that are created by the government. We've got to invest more in training them. We got to tell young people what program they need to do. The government needs to get involved in that whole process. And it just feels like we're moving towards a planned economy. And I kind of feel like we figured out a long time ago it doesn't work. This whole discussion around skill shortages and skill gaps and skill underutilization of immigrant skill, for me, if the issue is what Trevor, I think, is interested in, is long-run productivity growth, there still isn't a question about what productivity is. For ordinary people, it's about, labor productivity. For economists, it's not. It's about TFP. It's about total factor productivity. It's a totally different thing. So we're not even defining, what are we talking about here that we want to grow. But if that's what you want to grow, if it's really long-run growth, then really it's all about, the labor demand is entirely endogenous to the economy. It's driven by two things in the long run: technological change and labor supply. There is absolutely no sense in which there's labor shortages or skill gaps or anything in the long run. It doesn't make any sense to even begin to talk about that. So if you wanted, a high skilled, maybe I'll just end with this because I could go on and on. But if you want to think about this, think about it in the following simple question. Suppose you ran a university and you're like a full dictator over this. You could do whatever you want with this university, but your only objective was that the outflow from the university, the graduates, you wanted to boost the average quality of those students. In particular, you wanted innovators, people who are going to drive growth, go-getters, hungry people that are really, really, really smart. That's what you want. What would you do? Would you put more emphasis on the transformation process that happens in university, all the training and education you do? Would you put that, or would you put the emphasis on how we select? Would you get really good people to come in the first place? And I would say clearly the margin on which I'd be putting my dollars is on selection. And it really isn't that different in the economic immigration system.
Yeah, go ahead, jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, so think about it too. A couple of years ago when David Card won was one of the winners of the Nobel Prize in economics. One of the things he was credited for was this study done in 1994 on a minimum wage intervention done in New Jersey versus Pennsylvania. And I bring that up because when people talk about this, they'll often frame this as David Card won the Nobel Prize for proving that minimum wage always raises wages. That you can raise the minimum wage and there'll be no adverse consequences. And it's interesting because in his Nobel interview and in conversations, other interviews he's done, he pushed back against that, which was saying that what he and his co-author were really interested in was the conditions in which minimum wage may be an appropriate policy response. That under conditions of monopsony, when there were fewer employers with a large pool of workers that could collude together to sort of suppress wages, that actually could be an appropriate intervention. Now, why do I bring that? Why do I bring that up in this context? When we're talking about mismatched skills, we need to be really careful of really understanding and framing, is this a market failure? Is there some inefficiency in the Canadian market that entails some sort of very strong government intervention here? And what is that intervention to sort of correct this inefficiency, where we have immigrants have these skills and we have demand for labor that doesn't match those skills? Or if there isn't a market failure, then maybe either the supply of labor needs to fall or demand for that labor needs to go up in some way. And that might not actually call for the same type of intervention or even any intervention at all. So I guess, that's a very complicated way of saying that I'm not even sure if we have a very, very clear picture yet of what segments of the labor market in which we have mismatched skills, and whether or not the reason why we're seeing those mismatched skills are just, a glut of supply or insufficient demand, or what those conditions are. These are going to entail very, very different policy responses. One thing I'll say right now really quickly is a side note is that aside from the selection bit, we do a lot here in Canada to try to further integrate newcomers into the labor market. We spent last year we spent about $2.5 billion on immigrant survey agencies to help them get housed, to get into the labor force, to get re-credentialed, etc. And that's about a mid-sized file. It's not the biggest, but it's comparable in funding to Canada Community Building Fund, to the Permanent Public Transit Fund, and to Laboratories Canada. We don't have a very good idea if those programs do anything. The information goes into a system called iCare that goes back to the federal government. They use very, very broad categories. So we gave this person employment services. What kind of employment services, we're not quite sure. And we don't have, social science are evolving better causal models, and we can tease out cause and effect more and more. But as of right now, I'm not really aware that we actually really have very much causal research design. Causal research design is actually being applied to that sector as well. So not to say that what we do in Canada matters more than the selection bit, but just that if we look at this from the two ends of who do we select for entry into Canada and what do we do once they're here, I'm not exactly sure that we actually know if any enterprise we're doing once they're here actually doing anything.
Sorry, were you going to ask another question?
No, those panels work well if I only ask one.
Okay, great. Yeah, I guess I'm going to push back a tiny bit on what Mikal was saying about if your objective is to get the best people, whatever that means, then it's all about just bringing in the best people. But if you don't have places for those best people to work, to use their bestness, then how does that help for them to be the best? And so that's, I think, my biggest concern. I agree. We should have the best people coming to Canada. We shouldn't have substandard people. First thing is, what do we mean? Do we just mean like super high levels of numeracy skills, or do we just mean they have to be all, PhDs? Or do we also count things like emotional intelligence? Like skills themselves are something that we need to question. What do we mean by that? But then if we don't have jobs and employers who are willing to invest in them, as we were kind of talking about in the previous panel, then I don't know how that's beneficial for the country to just have this selection system.
Yes, Mikal, I'm sure you'll want to answer, but I want to just unpack two things there. Like there's do we have, even if we have the best people, do we have a place for them? But also there's also the selection aspect. But what do we mean when we mean the best people? Anyways.
So as I understand, the conference here today, it's about productivity. And as I understand, I think it's about labor productivity. It's about income per capita, GDP per capita, real GDP. And it's not the level, it's the growth. Mm-hmm. So when we say best, we have a pretty good idea of what that means, and we have a pretty good idea how to measure it. And that's earnings. It's immigrants' earnings in the long run. It's ideally their lifetime earnings profile, the present value of their lifetime earnings after they land in Canada. And so you can very easily, in fact, the government did this. The express entry system and the point system that exists within it, people don't recognize it, but that is the CRS when it was constructed was a prediction of that outcome. Mm-hmm. Where you're literally taking a large set of observable characteristics, an X vector, and you're using it to predict a Y, a scalar, expected lifetime earnings of this individual. I was involved a little bit in the creation of that. That was supposed to be something that wasn't static. It was something that was updated because labor markets are constantly evolving. And so, how do we ensure these people find a job? Well, that we don't ensure because there's some error in selection, of course, but you make the prediction system as good as possible. And so you use as many observables as you can to predict the lifetime earnings of these. And the evidence is pretty clear. So I'm working on a paper now with the labor force survey that shows very clearly, I think, that will come of it eventually and you can judge for yourself, but shows very clearly in this period of time over which we double down on this approach, the earnings of immigrants improved dramatically. Selecting on expected future earnings in Canada produces better outcomes. And that doesn't even say anything about the intergenerational effects.
And two of you want to go, whichever. Robert, you can go. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the fundamental question I have is when we talk about places for newcomers to arrive and to get attached to the labor market. I guess the question I have is fundamentally how do we identify those places? Because I think the category-based draws by express entry are an attempt to do that and try and say these are maybe potential places where people could work. But I'm not convinced that those are necessarily the best way to do that. Because what the federal government is trying to do in doing so, they're trying to say, well, these are the places we think there could or should be jobs. But those conditions change over time. The labor market evolves. There are recessions. Sometimes those recessions are sector specific, and so the human capital draw. And for those of you who aren't familiar, what we did for express entry and also an attempt to do before that was that if you're coming in under one of the point systems, the Canadian government would assign you a certain number of points for various characteristics you have. By the way, if you're ever curious, I've done this a few times. You always go to the calculator the government gives you, and you kind of figure out what is your own points word, and it gives you, the older you get, fewer points you get, the more education you have, the higher the points, more English or French, et cetera, et cetera. And in some ways, that was an attempt to, rather than trying to guess the places where jobs are needed, it was this idea that we could select for characteristics that are adaptable to higher incomes. And so I guess I'm not trying to even thread the needle here between Mikal and Rupa, but to really try to say, what are we trying, when we talk about selection and when we want really the fundamentally best outcomes for newcomers, both for themselves individually as well as for the national levels of productivity, I have to come back to, I think, that human capital factor might actually still be the least worst option. I mean, if somebody has some percentages for how do we improve that all years, but when we're trying to think about who do we invite to come to Canada that can raise national productivity, I that's why I kind of keep coming back to.
And I'm sure some of those points we'll get back to. So we're talking about the point system and people from being outside of Canada and applying to come in through the point system. And we know that now that's not how a lot of people come in. The 2-step, 3-step immigration process is now the norm. So I want to talk about first about temporary foreign workers and that program being under intense scrutiny right now for very different reasons, depending on who you ask. But if, again, the priority is productivity and growth in the long run, so what does a smart action plan look like right now for how, to some extent, dependent we've become of temporary foreign workers in the Canadian economy? What should we do now? I was going to say we know what the Conservative Party would do. We don't. And we know what we would do in the really short term, but not after that. But anyway, so I want to hear your thoughts on temporary foreign workers more specifically. Rupa, you can go first. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think that low-skilled temporary foreign workers is a problem. But at the same time, this is the situation we're in right now, is that we still have a huge stock of people who initially came in as students and now do have open work permits, who actually aren't in a low-skilled temporary foreign worker program at all. They're in IMPs, but are in effect working in low-skilled jobs. And so we could say, well, what should we do about it? But I think we have to be kind of like also living in the real world. We have this stock of people here right now. What do we do with them? And I don't have a good answer, because I don't think that means they should then transition to all permanent residents. But at the same time, I also think there's this level of exploitation within that program that, I don't have an answer to what we should do, but we just really need to be very cognizant of the fact that we've created this very messed up kind of situation, the scenario, where we know in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we will have a large proportion of people either who have become undocumented or are still waiting in the asylum system or have it canceled on them or will leave. And so just even in terms of our position in the world, our reputation for being this kind of leader in immigrant selection, I think it's just very damaging. I know I'm not answering your question about what we should do, because it's really difficult, because we have gotten ourselves into a very terrible situation, essentially.
Mireille, you want to...
I mean, I usually agree with Rupa, so I agree with that. I think that we're going to talk about provincial levers a little bit later, and I think that's something maybe where we can discuss the future of these programs. I think that there's clearly, we're experiencing a backlash for a lack of balance between these programs. These programs have been criticized for years by critical and non-critical migration activists, but at the same time, they are now, I think, a structural feature of our labor market. And so getting out of this addiction will demand transition measures. And so in the current discussion, I don't really know what that looks like for employers. And especially when we think about these programs responding to particular niche program in regions or in particular occupations. So for me, I've always been really uncomfortable with closed work permits. So once I've said that, I still don't know what would be a good solution beyond that.
Mikal, you've written on this.
I'm not quite sure if you were asking us specifically about the temporary foreign worker program or the international student programs.
Temporary foreign worker.
Yeah, I did. I wrote something a couple of weeks ago on that. I guess the punchline is, I think that should be phased out, the low skills streams. People then ask, how do you measure skills? Similar, Rupa was asking, how do you measure better? Well, we measure skills. The ESDC has a classification system of occupations, and every one of those occupation codes, if you look at the second digit, tells you the skill level, and it's based on what the educational requirements of the job are. And the fastest growing part of the TFW program in recent years has been on jobs that require high school or less. I think we should phase that out. I think the way you do that, at one point I had suggested a cap. I was convinced by people that work on the ground that that's probably not very feasible. I think then a better way to do it is through the LMIA price. The cost of LMIA is $1,000. It hasn't changed, nominally hasn't changed since 2015, which is just absurd. I mean, we've seen inflation in everything except for the LMIA. You just increase that price. But what you can do is you can be really smart about it, which, I really encourage IRCC to be smarter in a lot of ways with all the incredible data they have. But one way you can be smart about is you can vary the price by local unemployment rates. You can vary the price by labor market tightness within an occupation. You can also have what you call elevating prices. So as employers, the idea is, you don't want employers to become dependent on this program, that it's a business strategy to keep labor costs low. So what you do is you punish them if they continually use the program. So if you used the program last year to bring in those seasonal workers, now your price goes up and you just gradually increase the price. It's really not complicated, but it's in immigration. If you haven't already figured it out, all private interests pushing and lobbying their agenda, whether that's the service providers, the businesses that need the labor. And so nothing ever gets done because you've got so many competing interests looking for a piece of the pie.
By the way, one thing I'll mention here is that, sorry, Rupa.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add one tiny thing there. Like, I totally agree, but the problem is that the vast majority of this massive growth is not in the TFWPA.
That's another issue. Yeah.
Right? It's in the IMP, and these are folks that we don't even have data on.
Yeah.
We don't know where they are. We don't know how much they're making, and there's no LMIA process at all. So I think that's why I'm saying that it's such an intractable seeming problem at this.
So what
the IMP? Oh, sorry. But then the IMP was a response to the closed permit, right? And that was like the law, like everyone was so happy about it because finally we were getting people who could change employers and could escape, really bad working condition and abuse, but then we get into that problem. So
I would just say that the problem with the phenomenal growth in the international student entries, that they were just being rubber stamped and it completely exploded and grew out of whack with the ability to transition these large numbers. Let's go back in history and remind ourselves, what was the narrative that drove that? Labor shortages. It was entirely driven by this notion that the government has a responsibility to address labor shortages, like this is a problem in the economy that needs to be solved. And we're still talking about it. I mean, I've been listening to people today. We're still talking about labor shortages, skill mismatch, as if this is an economic problem that governments need to solve. I mean, that's what got us into the mess. It was as clear as I think I may be one of the few people in Canada that was saying, this makes no sense what the government is doing and raising these levels. And it was growing out of line. Pretty much nobody was saying anything about this for years. It was obvious what was happening. It was completely unsustainable.
Robert?
I guess the question I have, and there's a question for the audience. When you hear the term labor shortage, I guess, can somebody define that? What is a shortage? How do we quantify that? When do we actually reach a threshold where we have, an overabundance to sufficient to now we've entered a labor shortage?
You didn't think you were going to get quizzed?
I'm just genuinely curious. I think we hear there's a labor shortage and we panic, but why? Well, I would actually.
Is it? I'm not sure what the difference is.
Yeah. I mean, they manifest in the same way. I mean, like labor shortages. There is not a person there with the skills fit for what is being demanded. But I think specifically, it's not being demanded at a certain price. That there is a demand for that labor at a certain price, and there is not a body with the skills to fill it at that certain price. And so a labor shortage can also be a high demand. And there's no ways we can solve the demand, which is to increase the supply of that labor. And I think there are compelling reasons to sometimes occasionally do that through various interventions. But sometimes the other way you can do is to let the price increase. And a price in this context is higher wages for workers. Sorry, there's a bigger question here, which is I'm going to answer the short-term question here, because one thing I will say is that how the federal government has reacted to especially the international student program. also somewhat to the increase in refugee claims. I think it's been very broad and blunt, and so what they, for those, to provide some context, what they've done is now capped international students, and I think it's fair to say that the problem children in the room were always mostly the career colleges, especially. That's where a lot of this is occurring. Not so much, I'm sure there were, but not to the same extent at long-term established public universities. And yet it was very regional as well. This was very much a British Columbia and Ontario thing, although it was occurring in Alberta. But, there was very significant variation by region. And by sort of just doing this flat cap, I think it's in some ways punished, the responsible players in the area of post-secondary education. One thing I'll say there is maybe two solutions. One, I think short term, I actually might keep permanent resident levels higher than they actually made them. And the reason why is there needs to be almost a safety valve for those who are especially for those who are in country, to be able to transition off, lest we sort of end up with a population that is out of status, and even more, it's always more exploitable. It means we have this argument: do we reduce levels or raise levels in the future? And I think that's one worthwhile having. A very, very short term, I think there may even if it might impact productivity, there might be just for the social cohesion, but making sure we don't have a large out of status population in Canada. If you were to sort of amend this with this international student one, which you might consider even raising how much a student visa costs. I know this is something I've heard Mikal talk about as well. So where it's less, the incentive to come here and work is reduced a little bit by making sure that those who want to come here and study and get a Canadian education, that becomes their main priority. Yeah, Rupa, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think to build on what he just said, I think we're at risk of kind of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, right? So if we look at in the past 10 years, why have the earnings gotten better? Because most of those students who did manage to transition, 3 out of 10, right, were students first, then got a postgraduate work permit, managed to get a decent job on that postgraduate work permit, managed to transition. That transition process for some is kind of convoluted, complicated, and you have to show some resilience to be able to go through that and actually become PR. So those folks actually do very well. So I have an analysis where I actually look at different categories of IMP permit holders who transition to permanent residence. And it's the PGWP holders who actually do the best. So as much as we malign international students, they're the reason why our immigrant outcomes are actually pretty good, And so, I actually think that the long-term impact of immigration is being lost here. What do immigrants contribute to Canada's productivity in the long term? They contribute their children, right? And the intergenerational productivity of immigrants is huge. I don't have any data on that exactly, but I do know that they're much more likely to get a university degree, the second generation. They do, on average, earn more than third and higher generation Canadians. So even if the first generation struggles, which they do, I think that we have to keep our eye on this long-term thinking rather than the short-term thinking, which really has gotten us into this mess in the first place on so many levels, like we were talking about in the earlier panel as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
I totally agree with Rupa, because we clearly are looking some of the same data, or at least the different data sources telling you the same thing. There's been this market improvement from, if you look at landing cohorts, people making this transition to PR, 2015 to 2019, it's very clear improvement. After the pandemic kind of messes things up, it's just hard to interpret data, not that things get worse. But then after, there's also improvement, but very clearly that's reversed itself in 2022 or 2023, 24. It's coming back down. And that's when we get this movement towards basically getting away from the skilled immigration system to obsession with labor shortages and meeting current labor market needs that are overwhelmingly lower skilled. So the CBS, the category-based selection, PNP continues to grow, getting away from the CRS to screen. Yeah.
Okay, so talking about education, talking about the provincial nominee program, for instance, we tend to really especially outside of Quebec, really look in at the federal government when it comes to immigration. But I want to talk about the levers that provincial governments control. Again, thinking about productivity and growth. So what would you like to see from the provinces there? Of course, they don't control a lot of it, but they do control some of it when it comes to skills, to credential recognition, when it comes to the provincial nominee program as well. So what should we ask the provinces here? Again, thinking about productivity and growth in the long run.
So maybe I can start. So before even asking something of provinces, I think that we also have to acknowledge that what happened in the last 2 years has been a break in the trust relationship that was created between provinces and the federal government. So the caps to the PNP that were kind of unilateral, whether they were good or not, that's not the point. But after about 20 years of trying to build a collaborative relationship, kind of pulling the rug under PTs that way, means that, there's probably going to be less of a willingness to adopt new strategies or to be more responsive to new federal demands in immigration planning in years to come. So that being said, I also think that we need to recognize that the PNPs were used in strange ways sometimes. So PNPs are provincial nominee programs for those of you that are from Quebec, and they are programs that allow provinces outside of Quebec to select a portion of their skilled migrants. And it is true that in some provinces, the level of skills was quite lower than in federal program. That being said, the logic of the PNP was always to adjust the immigration system to regional labor market needs. So that would mean focusing on things like farm operators in some provinces as opposed to IT specialists. So I think that the tension between kind of making sure that the provincial programs can be regionally responsive, but at the same time ensuring the integrity of the overall logic of our immigration program remains a tension that is alive, but at the same time keeping that making sure that provinces are willing to enter into long-term planning when it comes to skilled immigrants will become exponentially harder, I think, after the last 2 years we experienced. I also think that one of the other things that provinces have not done well, and that in some cases Quebec has attempted to do, I'm not saying they've done it well either, but it's really to think about their own immigration strategy in relation to their post-secondary development and financing strategy. So the experiences we just had, again, with the cuts to the study permit has shown the dependence, of course, of provincial institutions, but it also shows that provinces had never kind of, internally sat together to really talk about that dependence and how they could do a better job at managing it. So I'll stop there. I think there's other things, but these would be the two first for me.
Mikal, yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's a very short, simple answer. If the objective is to leverage immigration to drive economic growth, not levels, but growth, there's actually no question in my mind. The right thing to do is shut down these PNPs. They shouldn't exist. I don't know what the point of. I know the point is to meet different objectives. It's you've got declining communities in certain parts of the country, and these local interests want to use immigration to prop up their towns and cities that are disappearing because there's no capital investment in those places. So young Canadians don't want to live in those places. So somehow they think immigrants want to live in those places. It's crazy. So we talk about interprovincial trade barriers and all these frictions that are created through provincial inconsistencies in regulations. Why are we doing this in immigration? And it's growing. I encourage everybody to look at these data. The percentage of new permanent residents, economic class permanent residents that are selected through a PNP is just going like this. So there's been a devolution of the whole program to the provinces. Standards are lower. People are gaming the system. Immigration lawyers and consultants are gaming the system to get people PR status through PEI, which has lower standards. And then as soon as you get PR, you leave. You had no intention of staying there in the first place because we don't want to restrict mobility rights in this country.
With all due respect, though, everyone is gaming the system, right? The immigration system is a system that is being gamed. We have a whole cottage industry of people just basically, selling permit. If we want to go into the integrity and migration industry thing, I don't think it's just a PNP thing. I think it's an overall issue, and it's going to be a growing issue. But I don't think that this is only happening. I just want to be clear that it's not just happening with the PNP.
Absolutely not. But there clearly is a way, when you think about optimal mechanism design or systems design, there's clearly a way to minimize the amount of corruption that's going on and the amount of gaming that's going on. And that's a simple system in which there's a single pathway to PR status that goes through express entry in the CRS system. That's how you minimize it. So that nobody needs a consultant or a lawyer anymore. It's right there. You go online, you look at the points, you see whether you're going to get it or not. You if you're below the points, you see, well, I got to improve my language score. Oh, I think I'll go invest in a little more language skills and I'll get my score up. That's how you minimize it.
Yeah, but I just want to push against that again. Like the people applying through Express Entry hire consultant back home. There is, they hire Canadian consultant as well to know how to get the most points into. So if that's I don't even think that a single player will remove that. The amount of gaming the system, as you call, is, as big for Express Entry as it is for provinces. It's just a different mechanism of gaming.
What I'm saying is a world in which there's one pathway. Right now, every world there's 20 pathways. So I need a lawyer to tell me which pathway I should take. I'm envisioning a world in which there's literally one pathway. What will the consultant advise me on then? There's only one way through the gate.
But he's going to advise you on a lot of other things.
I don't know. All I'm saying is you clearly minimize the role of consultants and lawyers if there's one pathway.
I mean, if the lawyer or the consultant tells you should learn French, then that's useful in a way, right? Like it's just
that's something that's a question here, but
that's what I'm saying. Like I mean, that's good for the system overall. It's not gaming the system; it's actually using the system correctly. Like,
well, that's what I was gonna say. Is that we have, where gamification happens, we can actually sort of see like what games actually. The games aren't bad. Games are inherently are normatively neutral things. The question is, what do we want people to game? And what we ideally want people to game is game type of things that help, if the question is productivity, we want them to gain certain things that actually increase their productivity here in Canada. It just kind of make this a bit, a little more explicit here. Essentially, the way that the provincial nominee system works is that it's a positive veto, which is that when you don't have enough points, the federal government vetoes the federal government says you cannot come into Canada. And the province essentially vetoes that negative decision and says, okay, you can come in so long as you settle in the province of, PEI, Ontario, et cetera, for at least a certain period. And then they don't even necessarily stay there. But there's other ways. I kind of agree that I think simplifying things might make things, making them more transparent, consistent. There are currently 140 or so on my tracking sheet existing or grandfathered programs. So 140 economic pathways into Canada, making that much more simpler and sort of directing the gamification, as it were, towards increased productivity, I think would be strongly beneficial in that regard. But, if to the extent that we still have the PMP, provinces are free to, add conditions on there that the federal government is not looking at that could actually increase income. For example, and obviously, these are their issues always. So don't come at me yet. You want to do some sort of analysis on this. But if there was a way to sort of credibly assess what somebody's income was in their home countries, maybe would we consider that? I know. I don't know.
The information asymmetry in migration decision and migration assessment are so big. We keep talking about this, but it's really hard to get that information to get it right. And we're not willing to invest in a system that will allow us to get that information. Plus, people lie all the time in immigration. It's just a given, and it's okay.
Not just in immigration, yeah, in everything.
No. Again, credible. Obviously, it's a big question what constitutes credible there, but or for example, again, you're gonna hear it's cringe. You're the GPA of somebody. That's something that
They did that
for express entry.
No, for getting the degree.
No, we do not.
Oh.
Universities do, but let's say you had a GPA from a foreign credential, and we said, let you actually higher GPA actually with a WES, assessment that actually let you get more points. I
think there's much lower hanging fruit. So we don't currently use field of studies. So it doesn't matter if you've got a degree in fine arts or in computer science. Doesn't matter what university you've gone to, you get exactly the same.
But Mikal, isn't that kind of like the category-based selection again? When you start using field of study?
No, because in category-based selection, it's a discretion-based system that the minister of the day gets to pick and choose.
So who's going to choose which field of study is valuable and which isn't?
That's what I was talking about before. It's the CRS system, which is an empirical prediction of future lifetime earnings in Canada. So it comes off the IMDb, where you are using the data. The points come from a regression.
I understand, but
Yeah, so it's an empirical.
occupations also make different earnings, right? So you could use. I'm not advocating category-based selection. I think that's also a mistake. But field of study has the same kind of concerns.
Field of study is highly predictive of earnings in the long run. Why would we not use that? If we have two candidates that look identical in every way, and one has a degree in computer science and the other one in fine arts, and the earnings data tell us that historically the one with the computer science degree has performed much better, why would we prioritize the one in fine arts? You don't let the minister of the day decide, because then the fine arts lobbyists convince her that she should prioritize the fine arts.
Of which there are many.
You have a rules-based system that ties the minister's hands, and it's entirely data-driven, and they have the data to do it.
Okay, can I just go back very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
To the question of the PNPs.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do a small history lesson, right? When the PNPs were introduced, 1998, right? They actually led to some regionalization, and it wasn't a complete wheels have fallen off the bus disaster until very recently, when we've seen this massive growth, some fraud, growth of the career colleges. It's so multifactorial. We can't just say that it was the PNPs that caused this problem of low-skilled people getting in, gaming the system, and then essentially driving down the productivity of newcomers. I would say that for a long time, our PNPs worked quite well and actually led to some regionalization where the pressure of immigration and the population growth that led to that kind of was dispersed. And we saw more people settling in the Atlantic provinces. We saw more immigrants settling in Alberta or Saskatchewan. So I think there's room to improve. There's room to draw back, to make smaller, to have guardrails in place to make sure some of this fraud doesn't happen. But I wouldn't say we don't need any PNPs at all.
Can I just jump in? So the question you meant to ask, you still haven't asked us, is what is our dream for the new immigration plan? And so I'm going to start answering that, because I think...
I don't even have to ask that.
Yeah. So I think that it's also, and maybe that's where the differences come, is that I think that as someone who studies public policy, I cannot think of Canada's immigration program as ever having been driven by a single goal, right? It's never been a productivity only program, right? There were goals of nation building for some time. Then there were things about population, one of my favorite topic, and Robert's as well. There's the goal of regionalization. And so then the question becomes, how can we address all these goals while increasing productivity? And so or growth. Mikal don't agree with me. But I think that some of these solutions cannot be I don't disagree with you. No one wants to live in the end of Saskatoon, indeed. But we decided as a society.
I was looking forward.
No, Danielle was Danielle. But we decided as a society that this has value for us, right? And so then that means that maybe we need different solutions for different goals in our immigration program. Maybe the question is about the balance between this high skill, this high growth type of individual, but also having some regionalization. And maybe in that case, it's not the same people, because the people that will be happy in Saskatoon, besides Danielle, maybe have a different desire for their professional life, for the kind of earnings they're going to have, than people who are going to live in the core downtown Toronto, right? And so I'm sure we're capable of finding a solution that will address these two things. And then I have other things that I want to say, but...
Yeah, never name a city when you...
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to...
you need to invent one.
Yeah, sorry. I'll say Trois-Rivières, so it's going to be a little bit better. Because the thing I really wanted to talk about when it comes to productivity, and it goes a little bit with what Rupa started to talk about, is that the thing that's been one of the tragedy of the last 3 years is that we have completely lost the plot on the population question when it comes to migration. So if there's one thing that I'm personally quite concerned in the long term is what happens to our population base. And sadly, we've not been able to, or like, some people have kind of taken that mental and we're not able to have this discussion collectively. But, when I think about what I need our immigration policy to be is like, yes, to deal with those current issues that we were talking about. So having potentially undocumented population growing, the impact on post-secondary institutions. But if you look 20 years in, what we need is bodies, right? And so we need to find a way to talk about growth and productivity, but also acknowledge that maybe bodies in the medium term will have to be quite different than the bodies these bodies are going to create. And I know it sounds a little strange, but it's what it is as well. And because we are in a current situation where this question of population growth has been so politicized, and because Canada has never been able to have a good discussion about population in its own history, we are stuck again focusing on short-term and medium-term issues, whereas, so that's the thing I want. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the question to the three of you that Mireille just answered, because I said that Prime Minister Carney said that there would be an immigration plan in the budget. I'm not exactly sure what that means, so that's a question for you. So what do you think will be there in the budget, and alternatively, because I'm sure that's not the same answer, what would you like to see in there in the budget as an immigration plan?
Okay, so I think it will be a bit of a nothing burger. Pretty much stay the course, keep the numbers the way they are, maybe adjust them a little bit down, a little bit up, because I think maybe the provincial nominee numbers will go up a bit, actually. What I think. What do I want? I think the permanent resident numbers need to go up a bit. I think they actually need to address the current situation we're in, which to me, having a large undocumented population is something that's really damaging to us. And we need to try and avoid that by having more spots for those people who are already here. I want to say something that isn't part of your question.
That's okay.
I think the biggest concern I have about this, I also agree that we need a simplified immigration system, not all these pilot programs, not all these crazy routes and pathways and all that. But at the same time, we've had a point system since 1967. It hasn't been that great. It hasn't been that bad, but it hasn't been that great either. And if you actually look at how much the points you got predict your earnings, it's not that high. There's a lot unexplained. And that unexplained portion needs to be talked about and brought out. If you actually look at one of the major things on the regression on what predicts your earnings, it's your country of origin, it's your race. So if we really want to go data-based, regression-based, then you should select white people from England who speak English as a first language. That is the person who does the best in Canada. So, we're obviously not going to do that, right? So I think we have to just be realistic that we don't have a great system for determining who the best is and who the most productive will be. We have something, it's not great. And so I don't have an answer, but just want.
Yeah, Mikal on...
Well, first, that's just not right. It's not white people. And clearly you don't want to put race into the CRS. That's clearly a non-starter. I mean, it's not ambiguous what you can discriminate on and what you can't. So you can discriminate on field of study, for example. I think that's something that makes sense. You have to discriminate somehow. So do you want people to line up in a queue and you just pick them randomly, or do you want to do it in a way that you're trying to meet an objective? So that comes to the second thing. What's the objective? Are there multiple objectives? We have been told by the Bank of Canada that there's a productivity emergency in this country. Yes, there are different objectives. There's, regional towns are disappearing in certain parts of the country. We'd like to use immigration and force those people to live in those places that nobody else wants to live. There are current labor market needs that tend to be lower skilled jobs. That's an objective. The reality is that these objectives are not well aligned with the productivity objective. Mm-hmm. They're very poor. In fact, they're almost orthogonal in some cases. And so you can't just do everything. You have to commit. You got to pick something. That's the Tinbergen rule. That's the first winner of a Nobel Prize in economics. You got to pick an objective where you need at least as many policy instruments as you have policy objectives. And so you got to commit to something. That's an uncomfortable truth. And if you want to pick, regional, that's fine. But then you have to somehow ensure that migrants can't leave Saskatoon when they go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, to me, when we're in a productivity immersion, I think this is a really first-order problem, Canada's.
Okay.
I really do. And so, for us to say, well, we need to do other things, well, there's a trade-off there. I think we need to get serious now. Canada is in a very serious productivity crisis, in my view. There are very significant implications for our ability to redistribute income in a world in which the average size of this economic pie and slices are getting smaller. You want to see people's willingness to support progressive policies. Just wait what happens if we stay in this kind of flatlining productivity growth.
Robert, you get the final word, and then questions. Oh, okay. So Mireille will get the final word. Sorry.
What do I expect to see in the budget? I more or less agree that I think what the immigration level plans that are out there will temporary and permanent, I expect will be the same. What would I like to see? I mentioned this before, but I would keep the levels for permanent residents a little bit higher right now. Even if we, reduce temporary residents. By the way, we can reduce the overall immigration level in Canada while keeping permanent resident levels high.
Yeah. But
I'd say my final word would be that it really comes down to deciding what do we want out of the immigration program. I mentioned this earlier, but if I were to have my way, I would do some more royal commissions and a royal commission on population. That would include what combination of capital investment, births, immigration do we feel is desirable in the country, and what is the objective of that?
Yeah.
I'm really I'm very, very grateful for the many objectives we have with our immigration policy. My father arrived in Canada in 22nd of September 1976, a young Chilean boy through the refugee program of mixed Latino, East Indian, and British descent. And he entered a country where, that cultural diversity aspect and that protective aspect was very, very important to not only him individually, but to my family. And I think that's something that Canadians really value here. I agree to that. We have to be very, very thoughtful to say, like, what are we trying to do with our immigration policy, and are the productivity gains in some way buying us the social license to be able to actually be more redistributed towards low-income Canadians, to the newcomers themselves who can use support, and then work backwards from there. We can have a cultural immigration program. We can have more francophones settle outside Quebec because we value bilingualism. We can value repopulating small town Canada because we want to establish legitimacy there. What do we want out of the immigration program, and then work backwards from there? We actually have some decent-ish, not perfect ideas about like how we structure it.
Yeah. Okay, Mireille.
No, it's okay. It was so good.
Questions from the floor. We have one from Trevor. It's taking time from all of you, so it's better be a good question.
Thank you. I think it's a good one, so we'll see who agrees. And so let me just blurt out the question straight up at first and then explain why it's a question. Does the temporary foreign worker program actually affect wages of young skilled or low skilled people in Canada? And why do I ask that? Because it seems so obvious that, if supply increases, then the wage will go down. Or if we didn't have TFWs, then wages would rise to close the gap between supply and demand, but not always. There's lots of situations where supply creates its own demand. Like my trade economist head goes straight to a Heckscher lean model. And if you want a great evening reading, Google's Cone of Diversification, where like wages are completely unrelated to the total stock of capital and labor in certain conditions. What changes is the size of the sector that disproportionately hires the low-skilled workers. And so that certainly matters for those who have fixed investments in those operations. And so I think, the temporary foreign worker program actually just keeps farm prices higher than they would otherwise be, and the franchise value of certain service sectors higher than it would otherwise be, but it doesn't really affect wages. And then I think, David Curtis, this great Mario Bolduc paper. And I don't know the literature since then. I'm sure there's lots of stuff that we know, but empirically, he's finding that you dump a boatload of individuals in Miami, and nothing happens to wages. Is that result still something that should guide our intuition, or how do we think about the TFW and wages given all that?
So the David Card Mireille paper is just like his minimum wage one. He got the right answer. And that's what won him the Nobel Prize. And I'll say this to David. I mean, he knows this as well. It's the answer that people want. I mean, you want, but if you take the hundreds of studies and you do that just with whether you do that with the minimum wage literature or the immigration literature, you don't get that result. The hundreds of studies, the distribution, there's a variance, but clearly shows disemployment effects of immigration and disemployment effects of minimum wages. Clearly. The issue really is very much about whether you're talking about the short run or long run. But the best evidence I've seen is that recent paper that was commissioned by the SDC on Canada's temporary foreign worker program, which they buried. But it does show disemployment effects within firms of temporary foreign workers. These are probably not huge effects. The program itself is not huge, but these effects are there. There's competition in like these short run effects. In the long run, there's sectoral implications. But yeah,
the extremists on both ends are wrong. Essentially, the people who say that this is going to radically reduce wages are wrong. The people who say that this is going to radically increase wages are also wrong. And actually, weirdly enough, the ones who actually tend to be the most competition are ones who are most similar to the newcomers. So it might not necessarily be that TFWs, disemploy a bunch of white collar workers in an Ottawa office or Toronto office. Or professors, TFWs might actually, there might be competition with the cohort that arrived like 6 months before them, sort of a thing.
We had a question in the middle here. And then we have one in the back and one on the left.
I don't think we have time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Quickly. Suzanne Paquet, University Laval. Mikal, I like your idea of getting the people predicting model with highest earnings, potential earnings. I love the idea. I'm not sure if this can't be the only way of choosing, because we have to think of other people. We need bodies. We need bodies to take care of older people, to teachers, to take care of our children as well. And these people are not necessarily the highest earners. And I know that we're talking about productivity, but if you have to take time off to take care of your children, to take care of your grandparents, and to take care of everything else, then you can't be productive. If you have a bad situation so that you are the one with a mental health problem, so you have high earning potential, but whoops, you got into the wrong group. Okay, you can't work anymore. So we need people to take care of these people. And yeah.
So I'm sympathetic. I understand, but I feel very strongly from the data that I have looked at over the years and how I understand how economic growth, like the standard neoclassical economic growth models, that if you are given a choice between two immigrants who are in the queue to become new permanent residents, one's a daycare worker, whether that's for children or the elderly, and one's a computer scientist who's working in the field of AI, that the economic growth potential to boost productivity, if that is your objective. But if you don't want to do that, if you want to say, well, I'm not interested in economic growth, I'm not interested in productivity, I want a country in which young people and old people all have a 1-to-1 ratio of a caretaker. Every elderly person has somebody. I don't know how feasible that would be in the long run. I suspect it's not. But if that's your objective, go for it. I'm not telling you not to. But I'm just saying, if your objective is productivity and prioritizing caregivers over computer scientists, not smart.
I hope with some closing remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce the director of the McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy and Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security. And so since we're here at McGill, it's a natural fit to hear from one of their leaders. And so the Max Bell School is known for tackling some of the toughest challenges in Canada. And as someone who comes from another policy school, I know how important it is to have these kinds of institutions shaping some of the debates
across this country. And so we're delighted she could be with us today. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Well.
Great. It's good to be here. And I actually feel somewhat bad because I feel like that immigration session could have continued to run, and I hope you stay afterwards to keep talking. I can't resist by saying, when we think particularly about immigration, I am first generation in my family to go to university, and I'm a proud graduate of the University of Saskatchewan. So, and that made all the difference, apparently, to my progress and earnings in life. So there's lots of places where we can all advance. But I just, and this is not to make you feel bad, but I'm actually going there on Thursday to give an annual lecture, and I also had lots of immigrants in my classes and their families. So there's various ways we can tell this story. But because I'm not an economist, I'm going to offer a little bit some reflections, and then also things I heard that I think were interesting or potentially pose some tensions. And I want to just begin by saying that we are clearly being told by the policy-making elites that the country's at a crisis point. It's at a fork in the road. That's the story that is very much in the public domain. And we've been, to come back to Mikal's point about what your objectives are, we've heard at least two major economic objectives being promoted over the last few months. One is that we need to diversify our trade relationships, and that's an objective of this government. And secondly, that we need to build a national economy, or a more of a national economy, let's put it that way. There's also a third objective that is hidden, but that has dominated some of the spending decisions in this country, and that is that we have to respond to some of the pressures and demands of our key allies, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And that is what drove some big decisions around defense spending. I want to put in brackets that it's not clear to me at all, because I don't think we have recent data on this, but I would love the economists to start working on this, what the actual positive spin-offs for the economy of defense spending are. Because we've actually heard that it's going to do a lot for Canada's economy. We haven't done this kind of thing in a very long time, and I think we need to know more about whether those benefits are coming. But I start with those objectives because they may or may not be aimed at higher productivity. It's not, the line isn't direct to those goals. And they're also based on assumptions. What we do know, and this is where Trevor, I thought was very interesting at the start, was that they are objectives that are being pursued in an environment of incredible uncertainty. And so I know in the other domains in which the school and myself are operating, part of our job as those who are engaged in policy relevant research, but also public policy making, is to actually have the skill to scenario plan and come up with possible directions and think about how policy options can respond to different scenarios. And I think that is a skill that the Canadian policy making community needs to get very good at in a hurry. My second point is, we had on that first panel discussion around the desire to move from a credential, particularly in education, a credential-dominated approach to one based on competency. And I do think for a long time, and this is a gross generalization, but many of us all day have been making generalizations, that universities have very much served not just as a credential organization, but a screening mechanism for employers, a hugely important screening mechanism. That's one of the great roles that leading universities, including our own, have made. But what I heard today suggests that instead, we need to start thinking much more about a potential skills mismatch. And I heard that there's a field of study mismatch and that there's a lack of foundational skills coming out of our key post-secondary institutions. I wanted to hear more about what those foundational skills really are. I think we need to come to some agreement if we are going to engage in a positive conversation with post-secondary institutions. We have to have a good sense of what they are. I think there was a nice phrase about how we use content versus just delivering content. But I want to make the point as someone who now is trying to operate in a post-secondary environment where AI is very present, that if assessment of attainment is really important, and I think it is, boy, do you need to invest resources and time in changing assessment. If we really want to do that, I would like to see some policy minds think about how we reassess whether people have the skills we want when they come out of different programs. So I think there was a really interesting discussion around that, but we tried to change assessment in the school and elsewhere. It is incredibly labor intensive, but I think we need to do it. But I just want to really double down on that part of this meeting this afternoon, because I think you're absolutely right that needs to be thought, but we cannot underestimate how hard it is to do. The third point is, I really enjoyed, and it was a bit provocative, the discussion around needing to look to private companies and the comparative data on how much Canadian companies invest in training and skills enhancement versus other jurisdictions. I think that's really, really interesting. Even the poking point about that we have a high tolerance for mediocrity. I think it's really interesting as well, and I'm going to say something controversial here, that I think we needed and need to push our private sector actors in a number of ways. It was obvious to many that it was a very risky strategy for Canada to be so leveraged with one trading partner. And we talked about diversification. But a lot of Canadian companies, despite telling us they were global and globally oriented, were not global at all. They were global in terms of the United States market. And so I think a conversation with private sector organizations now around the need to invest in skills is really, really important. A final point, perhaps, on immigration. I think the debate is becoming more and more interesting. I want to make a plug for a book that we've just released, and I'm going to Calgary tonight, which is why I have to rush, because the first lecture is tomorrow, called Borderline Chaos, about what happened in Canada's immigration system. It's written by Tony Keller, and it will be delivered in 3 Canadian cities. If you want to know more, go to our website. But I do think that I hope this book, but also the kind of conversations that we had, this was a very spicy panel, I love these, really does start to open up those conversations that are difficult around population size, around whether some of the programs we were really invested in, we need to let go of. You know, there's huge path dependence in public policy making in Canada that in this moment, we really need to let go of. Path dependence or sunk costs, it's not a good reason for holding on to things. We need to be willing to make those tough choices driven by clear objectives. I think it is true that we were presented with a narrative about labor shortages. That's what we heard before this big pivot. And we now need to be a lot more critical of some of the economic narratives that we are being presented with as a government. I just want to, by our government. I just want to end by thanking the IRPP and the Public Policy School at the University of Calgary for this event. I think it was a great gathering, really interesting minds in the room. And I hope the conversation can continue. It is incredibly important that we help government. I'm firmly convinced in this moment in Canada, our governments cannot do this alone. They need outside voices in academia, in public policy schools, and think tanks to really help present actionable ideas. We need to do our part. We all have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I will be there at the book event tomorrow. And if this is the first you've heard of it, I'm sure there are some seats on a plane that you could purchase now as well. And I can see you there as well. But to close us off, I'd like to welcome Rachel Sampson, who is the Vice President of Research at the IRPP. And as I mentioned, and as you've heard, the IRPP has been a key partner in this initiative from the very beginning. And Rachel and her colleagues have played a central role in making it all possible today. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome her for some closing comments.
Thanks. So just to note that I am not the president, I am the vice president of research at the IFPP. It's been a really inspiring afternoon of insights and discussion. I've learned a lot. Je tiens à remercier chacun d'entre vous d'avoir participé à une discussion essentielle pour l'avenir du Canada. We've all heard that Canada is facing an unprecedented array of challenges. A rupture in the relationship with our largest trading partner, threats to our sovereignty and security, the disruptive forces of artificial intelligence and climate change, an affordability crisis, disaffected youth, an aging population, lagging productivity, skills mismatches. Each challenge on its own is daunting, but in combination, they require nothing less than a rethinking of the policy frameworks governments have relied on for decades. It might be understandable if hearing that, people in the policy community start to feel a little pessimistic about Canada's future. I would, however, argue for optimism. In the past, Canadians, as we've heard, have tended towards accepting mediocrity or complacency. But faced with these risks, there's a new openness to change. This is a time of opportunity for big ideas and policy ideas backed by evidence. It's an opportunity to create a culture of possibility in Canada, which is something we haven't had for long. So now, as Jennifer said, it is the time to put forward new policy ideas, which is why we're so fortunate today to have many leading Canadian policy thinkers for today's event. The School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary is at the forefront of research on a range of public policy topics. And the Max Bell School of Public Policy is training future leaders to tackle the challenges Canada faces, including several that have come to the IRPP. And the IRPP is expanding its efforts to publish rigorous policy research to support government decisions on how best to position Canada and Canadians for success. I was heartened by the many excellent ideas we heard today on how to improve Canada's skills and immigration systems. Focusing on foundational skills, and I particularly like the skill of problem solving. More proactive skills policy. More coordinated skills policy regionally. Convincing employers to invest more in training sounds easy, but might be hard. Developing entrepreneurship as a way of thinking. Developing transition policies for any changes we make to the immigration system. And simplifying immigration. All of these seem like really good ideas. One thing I will note, however, from the IRPP's research that looks at communities that are susceptible to economic disruption is the importance of thinking about place when we design these policies. While around 60% of Canadians live in large urban centres, the remaining 40% are spread across smaller cities and towns and rural and remote areas in Canada. The skills and immigration needs in these areas can be very different than what they are in Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. In some small cities and towns, immigration has become an essential part of the community fabric and a key response to skills and labor shortages. One example, in Nipawin, Manitoba, the local pork plant hires Filipino workers who then bring their spouses and children to the community. The population of the town of around 6,000 people is now 50% Filipino. In the schools, the proportion of Filipino children is around 70%. The town, once aging and depopulating, is now a hub of activity with Filipino influences. Family members of the workers have filled labor shortages at the local hospital as nurses or in retail. Some of them have become entrepreneurs. On the other hand, another community that was profiling, Fort McMurray, Alberta, I was in a couple of weeks ago, and one of the people was lamenting the high rates of youth unemployment in the community. They felt that places that used to hire teenagers, like grocery stores, were instead hiring temporary foreign workers or being replaced with automation. Youth crime had increased in the community, and they blamed the lack of employment. These types of stories illustrate that one-size-fits-all solutions to skills and immigration may not work everywhere in Canada. Every community has its own story, and many are looking to have a greater voice in national policy conversations that affect them. So as we consider next steps, I would encourage all of us to step outside our urban bubbles and pull apart the numbers of any public policy issue to better understand the differences across regions, across communities, across income levels, across ages, and across populations. After all, if we're going to do big things in Canada, we need to bring everyone along for the ride. Those that get left behind or feel they are not being heard will be the sources of dissent that slows progress. Nowhere is that truer than with Indigenous peoples, who have too often been an afterthought on big projects or policy changes. When we see the enormous social and economic benefits that result when Indigenous communities, businesses, and people are given leading roles in change, it is important to support those efforts. One of the communities we profiled in our research was Kitimat and Kitimat Village in British Columbia. There, the Haisla Nation decided to not only demand benefits for their people from the LNG Canada project, but to lead an LNG project of their own, Cedar LNG. This move towards ownership is generating significant revenues that they can use to improve social and economic outcomes for their community. And it's also giving them a seat at the table on decision-making. It's an example of success from the bottom up instead of from the top down, highlighting that empowering community leaders can generate national success. In fact, we have repeatedly seen the difference that one person can make in these communities. Ainsi, lorsque nous pensons à des changements politiques, j'espère que nous pourrons également laisser une place à la réflexion sur les implications dans toutes les régions du Canada et sur la manière dont nous pouvons donner les moyens aux personnes qui travaillent à l'amélioration de leur communauté. Thanks again for the great discussion, and I look forward to connecting with all of you to continue the conversation.